You know that feeling when you are sitting across from your parent at dinner, and they are physically present, but somehow 1,000 miles away. They are looking at you, but not really seeing you. You are talking, but not really being heard. And the strangest part is that you have felt this way your entire life, and you have never once been able to explain why. This is not about blame. This is not about trauma dumping or pointing fingers across a generational divide. This is about something far more quietly devastating. This is about understanding the invisible architecture that shaped the people who were supposed to shape you. Because before they were your parents, they were children too. And what happened to them in those childhood years did not disappear. It did not dissolve into adulthood. It went underground. It became the emotional blueprint from which they built everything, including how they built you. Gen X. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980. The forgotten generation. The one sandwiched between the boomers who got all the cultural mythology and the millennials who got all the internet think pieces. Gen X grew up quietly, raised themselves, mostly, and then they grew up and had children and passed on a very specific kind of emotional inheritance that most of us are only now beginning to understand. What you are about to hear is not a character assassination. It is a psychological autopsy of an entire generation, and it will change the way you see your parent, your childhood, and perhaps most importantly, yourself. Part 1. The latchkey architecture. Picture a child, somewhere between 8 and 12 years old, coming home from school to an empty house. Not occasionally, every day. They pull out a key that is strung around their neck on a piece of yarn. They let themselves in. They make their own snack. They do their homework alone. They watch television until a parent comes home, exhausted from work. And then the parent arrives, and there is not a dramatic homecoming. There is not a warm, curious conversation about the child day. There is silence, or stress, or the television goes on in the other room. The child has already learned not to need too much, not to ask too much, not to feel too much out loud. This is the origin story of the Gen X parent. Not a dramatic origin story. Not one single wound, but a slow, cumulative kind of emotional dehydration that happened so gradually, they never even noticed they were thirsty. The term that psychologists use for this particular developmental experience is emotional neglect. And it is important to understand that emotional neglect is not abuse. It is an absence. It is what did not happen rather than what did. No one sat that child down and said, "Your feelings do not matter." But no one sat that child down and said, "Tell me how you are really doing," either. And in that silence, the child learned something that would follow them into adulthood and into parenthood. They learned that emotions are private, that needing people is weakness, that self-sufficiency is the highest virtue. The Gen X generation grew up in a cultural moment that actively celebrated independence. The 1970s and 1982 were not sentimental decades. They were sharp, pragmatic, sometimes brutal. Divorce rates spiked. Both parents entered the workforce in record numbers. The economic anxiety of stagflation and recession meant that survival, literal financial survival, was the dominant preoccupation of most households. Parents did not have the luxury of sitting with a child and asking, "What are you afraid of today?" They were too busy trying to keep the lights on. And so an entire generation of children grew up with this quiet and spoken understanding. You handle yourself. You figure it out. You do not fall apart, because there is no one waiting to catch you if you do. This is not tragedy. This is survival. But survival has a cost. And the cost, as you are about to understand, was paid forward. Part 2. The emotional vault. There is a psychological concept called alexithymia. It refers to the difficulty in identifying and describing your own emotions. Not the inability to feel, but the inability to name what you are feeling. To translate internal sensation into language. To reach inside your emotional architecture and pull something out and hand it to another person and say, This is what is happening in me." Gen X parents, as a collective, have one of the highest rates of functional alexithymia of any living generation. And this is not a character flaw. This is a learned adaptation. When you grow up in an environment where emotions are not witnessed, not validated, not discussed, You stop developing the neural pathways that allow you to process and communicate feeling. The emotional vocabulary simply does not get built, because no one was building it with you. Think about what that looks like in practice. Your parent is struggling. Something happened at work that terrified them. Something in the marriage is fraying at the edges. They are carrying grief or shame or fear, and they do not tell you. Not because they are protecting you, although they may believe that is what they are doing, but because they genuinely do not have the language for it. They do not know how to open that vault. They have been locked out of it for so long that they have forgotten the door exists. And so, what you experienced, growing up with a Gen X parent, was proximity without intimacy. They were there, physically present, providing for you, making sure you were fed and clothed and had what you needed. But there was a glass wall. You could see them, they could see you, but no one could reach through. And here is where it gets important. Because that glass wall was not cruelty. That glass wall was armor, built piece by piece. In childhood, in all those afternoons alone, all those dinners where no one asked how you were really doing, all those moments where the child learned that to have needs was to be inconvenient, the armor kept them safe then, and they never took it off, because no one ever showed them how. Part 3. The Independence Paradox. Here is the central paradox of the Gen X parent. They are simultaneously the most self-sufficient and the most emotionally dependent generation. And that sounds like a contradiction, but it is not. It is actually the most psychologically coherent thing about them. When you spend your childhood learning that you cannot rely on others for emotional support, you develop something that looks like independence, but is actually more complicated than that. You develop a profound competence in the external world. Gen X parents are often extraordinarily capable. They are problem solvers. They are pragmatic under pressure. They do not panic when practical things go wrong, because they have been navigating practical things alone since they were small. They know how to fix, how to manage, how to handle. This is real. This is not performance. This is a skill set earned through genuine early self-reliance. But the inner world, the emotional interior, the messy, irrational, vulnerable human core that does not submit to logic or competence or willpower, that world was never developed in the same way. And so, what you have is a person who can solve almost any external problem, but who becomes almost paralyzed when confronted with an emotional one. Their own or yours. You have seen this. You have watched your Gen X parent respond to your tears with practical suggestions instead of comfort. You have gone to them in pain and received a plan instead of an embrace. Not because they did not care, but because caring, a way they understood it, meant solving. Because solving was what they had. Sitting with, feeling, witnessing pain without trying to fix it. That was never modeled for them. That was never a skill they were given a chance to develop. And here's the part that perhaps hurts most to hear. Because they never receive that kind of witnessing themselves, they often do not know that it is missing. They do not experience a gap. They do not feel the absence of emotional attunement in their parenting, because they never experienced emotional attunement in their childhood. You cannot grieve something you do not know existed. Part 4. The Cool Parent Mask. There is a specific Gen X parenting style that you may recognize. The parent who wants to be your friend. The parent who is casually cool, who does not place too many rules, who tells you about their own experiences in a way that feels more like peer sharing than parental guidance. The parent who says, "You can talk to me about anything." But then, when you actually do, become subtly uncomfortable, subtly distant, subtly unavailable in the very moment you most need them to lean in. This is not manipulation. This is unconscious repetition. This is what psychologists call counterdependent behavior, wearing the mask of emotional openness. The Gen X parent who performs availability but cannot sustain it is not lying. They genuinely want to be that open, warm presence for their child. But the moment real emotional weight enters the room, the old armor comes up automatically. The survival instinct kicks in. The distance is re-established, and the child is left confused. Because the door was supposed to be open. It looked open, but somehow, when you walked toward it, it closed. Carl Jung wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world, and the self, the authentic interior that the persona is designed to protect. For the Gen X parent, the cool parent persona is a masterwork of social engineering. It communicates, I am not like my parents, I am evolved, I am modern, I am safe. But beneath the persona, the same old architecture exists. The same emotional vault, the same discomfort with vulnerability, the same reflex to retreat when things get real. And this is not hypocrisy. This is the heartbreaking thing. This is a person genuinely trying to be better than what they received. They saw the emotional distance of their own boomer parents, and they recoiled from it. They made a conscious decision to be different. And they are different. In many ways, they are genuinely better. But the wound underneath, the one that was never treated, the one that became armor, still runs the show from behind the scenes. Part 5. The Achievement Trap. There is another layer here that needs to be named carefully, because it is subtle, and it is painful, and if you grew up with a Gen X parent, you have probably felt it without being able to articulate it. Gen X grew up in a world that measured worth through productivity, through achievement, through external markers of success. The cultural message of the 1980s was relentless in its insistence that you are what you accomplish, that your value is demonstrated by how hard you work, how much you earn, how impressive your resume looks. This was the decade of Wall Street and greed is good, and the hyper-individualism of Reaganomics and Thatcherism. The cultural air was thick with the message that softness was weakness and ambition was virtue. The children who grew up inhaling that cultural air became adults who unconsciously measured themselves, and then their children, through the same lens. Not out of coldness, out of genuine belief. A belief that was installed so early, and so completely that it functions more like biology than ideology. And so you may have grown up with a parent who praised your achievements effusively, but seemed slightly uncertain of how to respond to your simply existing, to your being rather than your doing. You brought home a grade and their face lit up. You came home just wanting to be with them, just wanting to sit in their presence, and be loved without having to earn it. And something in them did not quite know what to do with that. Not because they loved you less in those moments, but because they had never been loved like that themselves. Quiet, unearned, unconditional presence was not something they had an internal map for, and you cannot give what you have never been given. The psychological term for this is conditional positive regard. The child receives warmth and validation that is tied, however subtly, to performance. And the child learns, over time, that love is something you earn, that you stay lovable by staying impressive, that the moment you fall apart, the moment you fail, the moment you stop performing, you risk losing the thing you most need. And so the child becomes very good at performing, at achieving, at presenting a face to the world that earns approval, at building their own armor. And the cycle continues. Part 6. The Humor Shield. Ask anyone who grew up with a Gen X parent, and they will almost certainly tell you that their parent was funny. Darkly funny, often. Sarcastically funny. The kind of funny that turns pain into a punchline before the pain can become a conversation. Humor in the Gen X emotional toolkit functions as a deflection mechanism of extraordinary elegance. When something emotionally heavy enters the room, the Gen X parent reaches for wit, for irony, for a well-timed joke that lightens the atmosphere but simultaneously closes the door on whatever was trying to be felt. And because the humor is genuinely good, because it is smart and sharp, and even sometimes profound, it is very hard to identify it as armor. It looks like personality. It looks like a gift. And it is a gift. But it is also a wall. This is not cynicism. This is not me telling you that laughter is bad. Humor is one of the most sophisticated coping mechanisms available to the human psyche. Psychologists who study resilience consistently find that the ability to find dark humor in dark circumstances is a marker of genuine psychological strength. The Gen X generation survived its collective childhood in part because it learned to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. The empty house, the distracted parents, the economic instability, the cultural chaos of a world that seemed to be constantly on the edge of something terrible. You either cry, or you develop a terrifyingly good sense of irony. But here is the shadow side. When humor becomes the automatic response to every emotionally charged moment, it trains the people around you not to bring those moments. Children of Gen X parents often describe a specific learned behavior, the suppression of their own emotional weight, before expressing it, because they have come to anticipate the pivot to a joke before the feeling can be witnessed. And they love their parent too much to sit in the awkwardness of that moment. So they join the joke, and the feeling stays unwitnessed, and both people walk away from the conversation having had a perfectly pleasant interaction that touched nothing real. Part 7. The invisible grief. Here's something that almost never gets said. Gen X parents carry grief that they have never named. A specific, compound grief. The grief of a childhood that asked too much of them too soon. The grief of parents who were there but not present. The grief of having had to become competent before they were finished being children. The grief of watching the world change beneath their feet in ways that no cultural institution prepared them for. The grief of coming of age during AIDS. During economic collapse, during the quiet death of the American dream, they were promised. The grief of a generation that was never given permission to grieve. And now, they are in their 40s and 50s, and that grief is still there. Still underground. Still running the underground architecture of who they are and how they love. And no one is naming it. Because Gen X does not ask for help. That is not what you do. You handle it. You keep moving. You do not stop to cry in the middle of the race, because stopping feels like losing, and losing was never an option in the house where the key was on the yarn around your neck. The German language has a word that English lacks. The word is Weltschmerz. It translates roughly as world pain. The ache of experiencing the world as it is against the backdrop of how it should be. And Gen X carries a particular flavor of Weltschmerz that is almost never discussed. Because they grew up just idealistic enough to believe things should be different, and just pragmatic enough to decide that believing that was a waste of emotional energy. So they compressed it. They stored it somewhere in the body, in the tight shoulders, in the dark humor, in the restless dissatisfaction that no amount of external achievement ever quite resolves. And then they became parents, and their children look up at them with eyes full of need and hope, and the radical demand of unconditional love. And the Gen X parent gives what they can, which is often extraordinary, often fierce, often deeply devoted, but there is something held back, something behind the glass, something in the vault, and the child feels it without being able to name it, and grows up with their own quiet, unnameable ache. Part 8. The overcorrected child. You might be that child. You might be reading this and recognizing yourself in what I am describing. And if you are, it is important that you hear this clearly. The way you learn to love is not your fault. The patterns you are carrying, the ones that feel like personality traits, but are actually survival strategies. Those were not failures of character. They were adaptations. Brilliant, sophisticated, psychologically necessary adaptations that a child made in response to a very specific emotional environment. Maybe you became the caretaker, the one who learned to read the room before you entered it, the one who could tell from a parent mood within 3 seconds of seeing them whether it was a day to be present or a day to disappear, the one who became extraordinarily attuned to the emotional states of others while losing track entirely of your own. This is called hypervigilant attachment, and it is not a disorder. It is intelligence. It is a child becoming an expert in the landscape they were born into. Maybe you became the achiever, the one who discovered early that performance was the currency of love, who built a whole identity around excellence, because excellence was the one thing that reliably generated warmth from an otherwise glass-walled parent. And now, you are an adult, and you cannot stop. You cannot just exist without accomplishing. Because somewhere in your emotional architecture, existing without producing feels dangerous, feels like risking the love, even though the love is no longer contingent on performance. Even though the parent you are performing for is inside you now, not outside you. Maybe you became the emotional island, the one who learned, by watching your Gen X parent, that need is inconvenience, that vulnerability is weakness, that independence is survival. And so you became extraordinarily self-sufficient, admirably capable, and quietly, chronically lonely in the way that only people who have never learned to let others in can be lonely. None of these are your fault. All of them are understandable, and all of them can be understood, named, and slowly, gently, rewired. not erased, not overwritten, but understood. Because understanding is the beginning of everything. Part 9. What they were trying to say is the thing about your Gen X parent. The thing that perhaps you have not yet been able to see, because the hurt has been in the way. They were trying, with everything they had, with every tool they possessed, with the entire emotional vocabulary they were given, which was limited and imprecise, and sometimes wholly inadequate. They were trying. The parent who responded to your pain with practical advice was trying to protect you from the pain. They did not know how to just sit in it with you, but they desperately wanted the pain to stop. That is love. Imperfect, misdirected, sometimes counterproductive love. But love. The parent who made a joke when you cried was trying to lighten the weight, to make it bearable, to use the one tool they had that they trusted. Humor had saved them in their own childhood. Of course, they reached for it when they saw their child suffering. That is love. Wrapped in the wrong package, maybe, but love. The parent who seemed more comfortable with your achievements than your feelings was trying to help you build something that would protect you in a world they knew to be fundamentally unsafe. They were trying to give you the tools they wished they had had. The competence, the independence, the thick skin, because they genuinely believed that those things would keep you safe in a way that emotional softness would not. That is love, filtered through a lens that distorts it almost beyond recognition. But love. The Gen X parent did not set out to leave you feeling unseen. They set out to raise someone strong, someone capable, someone who could survive in a world that had not been particularly gentle with them. And in some ways, they succeeded. You are reading this. You are seeking understanding rather than simply living inside confusion. That is its own kind of strength. A strength that came, in part, from them. Part 10. The new language is a concept in developmental psychology called earned secure attachment. It refers to the process by which an adult who did not receive secure attachment in childhood can build it, through therapy, through self-awareness, through relationships that model something new, into their own emotional architecture. It is one of the most quietly radical findings in the field of attachment research. Because it means the story is not finished. It means the inheritance is not destiny. And this applies both to you and to your Gen X parent. Because something extraordinary is happening with this generation of parents right now. Something that has never quite happened before in the same way. For the first time, on a large cultural scale, there is language available for what happened to them. There is therapy. There is literature. There is this very conversation. And some of them are beginning to find their way toward it. You may have noticed a change in your Gen X parent in recent years. A softening, maybe. An unexpected vulnerability. A moment when they said something that surprised you. Something that came through the glass wall. Something real. This is not accident. This is the work of a generation that spent its first 40 years running and has started, cautiously, to look back. To look inward. To begin the painstaking process of learning, the emotional vocabulary they were never given in childhood. It is awkward. It is often clumsy. It sometimes looks like too little too late. But it is real, and it deserves to be seen as what it is. Courage. The particular, hard-won courage of someone who was taught that vulnerability is weakness, choosing vulnerability anyway. That is one of the most difficult things a human being can do. And some of your Gen X parents are doing it. Imperfectly, haltingly, but doing it. Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen a stranger staring back? Not literally, of course. But have you ever caught yourself saying something your mother always said, or reacting to a problem exactly like your father would have? It's an odd feeling, isn't it? As if you're living out a script written long before you were born. This is the inheritance you didn't choose. It's not about money or property or a dusty old antique. It's about the invisible baggage we all carry, the habits, the fears, the beliefs, and the emotional patterns passed down through our families, generation after generation. Think about it. We inherit our eye color, our height, the shape of our nose. We accept this as a simple fact of biology. But what about inheriting a quick temper, or a tendency towards anxiety, or that nagging feeling that you're never quite good enough? These traits aren't listed in a will. but they are just as much a part of our legacy. This is what psychologists sometimes call intergenerational trauma or familial patterns. It's the emotional DNA that shapes our lives in ways we're often not even aware of. Imagine a grandfather who lived through a severe famine. He developed a deep-seated fear of scarcity. He might have hoarded food, been extremely frugal, and constantly worried about not having enough. He passes these behaviors and this underlying anxiety onto his children. They might not understand why dad is so obsessed with saving every penny or why the pantry is always overflowing, but they absorb the lesson: the world is an uncertain place, and you must always be prepared for the worst. Now, those children grow up and have kids of their own. Maybe they don't hoard food, but they might be incredibly anxious about financial security. They might push their own children relentlessly to get high-paying jobs, not out of greed, but out of a deep, inherited fear of poverty they can't even name. And so, the pattern continues. The original trauma of the grandfather, the famine, is long gone, but its emotional echo, its ghost, still haunts the family, influencing decisions and creating stress for generations to come. This isn't just about negative traits. We inherit resilience, a strong work ethic, a sense of humor, a love for music. These are the beautiful parts of our unchosen inheritance. But it's the challenging patterns that often hold us back, that create friction in our relationships and keep us from feeling truly free. Do you see a pattern of failed relationships in your family? A history of addiction? A tendency to avoid conflict at all costs? These aren't personal failings. They are often learned survival mechanisms that, at one point, served a purpose for our ancestors, but are now holding us captive. The first step to breaking free from these invisible chains is awareness. It's about becoming a detective in your own life. Start by looking at your own behaviors, especially the ones that frustrate you. When you get angry, how do you express it? When you're sad, do you withdraw or seek comfort? When you're stressed, what's your go-to coping mechanism? Now, think about your parents. How did they handle these same emotions? What about your grandparents? You might start to see some surprising connections. Journaling can be an incredibly powerful tool for this. Write down your family stories. What were the major challenges your parents or grandparents faced? What were the unspoken rules in your childhood home? What topics were considered taboo? Things like, we don't talk about money, or we always put on a brave face, or don't air your dirty laundry in public. These unwritten rules are the codebook for your family's emotional operating system. When you start to map this out, you're not blaming anyone. This isn't about pointing fingers at your parents or grandparents. They were doing the best they could with the tools they were given. They inherited their own baggage, after all. This process is about understanding. It's about compassion, for them and for yourself. When you realize your fear of confrontation isn't a character flaw, but a learned behavior from a family that avoided conflict to survive, you can start to have some grace for yourself. Once you have that awareness, you can begin to make conscious choices. This is where your power lies. You can decide that the pattern stops with you. Just because your family has always dealt with stress by bottling it up, doesn't mean you have to. You can choose to learn new, healthier ways to cope. This is where the real work begins, and it's not always easy. It can feel like you're swimming against a powerful current. Therapy can be an incredible resource here. A good therapist can help you identify these patterns and give you the tools to build new ones. It's like having a guide who can help you navigate the tricky terrain of your own inner world. They can help you grieve for the childhood you may not have had and learn to parent yourself in the way you always needed. If professional help feels out of reach, there are so many amazing books, podcasts, and online communities dedicated to this very topic. You are not alone in this journey. One of the most transformative things you can do is to practice self-compassion. When you catch yourself falling back into an old pattern, don't beat yourself up. Acknowledge it without judgment. Say to yourself, there's that old pattern of people-pleasing I learned as a kid. It's just trying to keep me safe. I see it. And now, and choose something different. Every time you do this, you weaken the old neural pathway and strengthen a new one. You are literally rewiring your brain. Think of it like this. Your family passed down a recipe book. Some of the recipes are amazing, cherished traditions you'll want to keep forever. But some of them are outdated, unhealthy, and just don't work for you anymore. You don't have to throw out the whole book. You have the power to look at a recipe, say, "Thank you for getting us this far," and then write a new one. Your new recipe might involve setting boundaries, communicating your needs directly, or allowing yourself to be vulnerable. This journey is about reclaiming your own story. It's about taking the threads of your past, the good, the bad, and the complicated, and weaving them into a future of your own design. You get to decide which parts of your inheritance you want to carry forward, and which parts you are ready to respectfully leave behind. You are the bridge between your family's past and its future. By healing yourself, you're not just creating a better life for you, you're breaking the chain. You're giving a gift to the generations that will come after you, the gift of freedom. The inheritance you didn't choose doesn't have to be your destiny. It can be your starting point. It's the raw material you've been given to shape a life that is authentically, wonderfully, and completely yours. It's a profound act of love for yourself and for your family, both past and future. Take a moment today. Look in the mirror. See the features you inherited, but also see the person who has the power to choose their own path. Thanks for watching. If this video resonated with you, please consider sharing it. You never know who might need to hear this message today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on living a more conscious and fulfilling life. Take care.